Thank you, Randall, and thanks to all of you. It's great to be here. I have to say the best period of our life was living across the street from the Mackeys. They were just a lot of fun. Their kids were constantly in and out of our house, and our kids in and out of their house, and it was just a great stage of life, I think, for both of us. And well, that was just a very, very memorable time. I want to talk today about my great-grandmother, Mary Goebel Pay, who at age 13 traveled with her parents from Brighton, England to Salt Lake City in 1856 and were caught in the storms of the in October of 1856 along with the handcart companies, and had such a terrible experience in so many ways coming across. Three of her younger siblings, including a baby that was born on the trek, were buried along the trail. Her mother died just hours before they arrived in the valley, died at the top of Emigration Canyon. When Mary was 60 years old, a granddaughter of hers persuaded her to write a brief memoir of her experiences. She'd never written this down. That was true of most of the people who came through those experiences that year. They didn't talk about them very much for many, many years. She wrote, at the request of her granddaughter, a little handwritten memoir in a ledger book that totals 14 pages, 4 of which deal with the journey of her family from England to the Salt Lake Valley. That little memoir has become something of a classic in Latter-day Saint literature. Many of you may be familiar with it. But I've asked my wife to take about 10 minutes and read some excerpts from this story before I go in and talk about some additional surrounding material. So Kathleen.
I, Mary Goebel, was born in Brighton, Sussex, England, on the 2nd of June, 1843. When I was in my 12th year, my parents joined the Latter-day Saints. On November 5th, I was baptized. The following May, we started for Utah. We left our home on May 19th, 1856. We came to London the first day. The next day we came to Liverpool and went on board the ship Horizon that evening. It was a sailing vessel, and there were nearly 900 souls on board. We sailed on the 25th. I well remember how we watched old England fade far from sight. We sang, "Farewell, our native land, farewell." After we got over our seasickness, we had a nice time. We would play games and sing songs of Zion. We held meetings and time passed happily. We were on the sea 6 weeks, and when we landed in Boston, we took the train from Iowa City, where we had to get an outfit for the planes. It was the end of July. On the 1st of August, we started to travel with our ox teams unbroke and did not know a thing about driving oxen. My father had bought 2 yoke of oxen and 1 yoke of cows, a wagon and a tent. He had a wife and 6 children. Their names were Mary, Edwin, Caroline, Harriet, James, and Fanny. My sister Fanny broke out with the measles on the ship when we were in, and when we were in Iowa campgrounds, there came a thunderstorm that blew down our shelter that was made with hand carts and some quilts. The storm came and we sat there in the rain, thunder, and lightning. My sister got wet and died the 19th of July, 1856. She would have been 2 years old on the 23rd. The day we started our journey, we visited her grave. We felt very bad to leave our little sister there. We traveled through the states until we came to Council Bluffs. Then we started our journey of 1,000 miles over the plains. It was about the last of September. We traveled 15 to 25 miles a day. We used to stop one day in the week to wash. And on Sunday, we would hold our meetings and rest. Every morning and night, we were called to prayers by the bugle. The Indians were on the warpath and very hostile. Our captain, John Hunt, had us make a dark camp. That was to stop and get our supper, then travel a few miles and not light any fires, but camp and go to bed. Just camp and go to bed. The men had to travel all day and guard every other night. One night, the cattle were in the corral, which was made with wagons, when one of the guards saw something crawling along the ground. All in a moment, the cattle started. It was a noise like thunder. The guard shot off his gun. The animals jumped and ran. It was an Indian with a buffalo robe on. Mother and the children were sitting in the tent. Father was on guard. We were surely frightened, but Father came running in and told us not to be afraid, for everything was all right. We traveled till we got to the Platte River. That was the last walk I ever had with my mother. We caught up with the handcart companies that day. We watched them cross the river. There were great lumps of ice floating down the river. It was bitter cold. The next morning, there were 14 dead in camp through the cold. We went back to camp and went to prayers. We sang the song, "Come, come, ye saints, no toil nor labor fear." I wondered what made my mother cry. That night, my mother took sick, and the next morning, my little sister was born. It was the 23rd of September. We named her Edith, and she lived for 6 weeks and died for want of nourishment. We had been without water for several days, just drinking snow water. And the captain said there was a spring of fresh water just a few miles away. It was snowing hard, but my mother begged me to go and get her a drink. Another lady went with me. We were about halfway to the spring when we found an old man who had fallen in the snow. He was frozen so stiff we could not lift him. So the lady told me where to go, and she would go back to camp to help, for we knew that soon he would be frozen if we left him. When she had gone, I began to think of the Indians, and looking all directions, I became confused and forgot the way I should go. I waded around in the snow up to my knees, and I became lost. Later, when I did not return to camp, the men started out after me. It was 11 p.m. before they found me. My feet and legs were frozen. They carried me to camp and rubbed me with snow. They put my feet in a bucket of water. The pain was so terrible. The frost came out of my legs and feet, but did not come out of my toes. We traveled in the snow from the last crossing of the Platte River. We had orders not to pass the handcart companies. We had to keep close to them in order to help if we could. We began to get short of food, and our cattle gave out. We could only travel a few miles a day. When we started out of camp in the morning, the brethren would shovel the snow to make a track for our cattle. They were weak for want of food, as the buffaloes were in large herds by the road and ate all the grass. When we arrived at Devil's Gate, it was bitter cold. We left lots of our things there. There were 2 or 3 log houses. We left our wagons and joined teams with a man named James Barman. He had a sister, Mary, who froze to death. We stayed there 2 or 3 days. While there, an ox fell on the ice, and the brethren killed it, and the beef was given out to camp. My brother James ate a hearty supper and was as well as ever when he went to bed. In the morning, he was dead. My feet were frozen. Also, my brother Edwin and my sister Caroline had their feet frozen. It was nothing but snow. We could not drive the pegs into the ground for our tents. Father would clean a place for our tents and put snow around to keep it down. We were short of flour, but Father was a good shot. They called him the hunter of the camp. So that helped us out. We could not get enough flour for bread, as we got only 1/4 of a pound per head per day. We would make it like thin gruel. We called it skilly. There were 4 companies on the plains. We did not know what would become of us. One night, a man came to our camp and told us there would be plenty of flour in the morning, for Brother Brigham Young had sent men and teams to help us. There was rejoicing that night. We sang songs, some danced, some cried. His name was Ephraim Hanks. We thought he was a living Santa Claus. We traveled faster now that we had horse teams. My mother never got well. She lingered until the 11th of December, the day we arrived in Salt Lake City, 1856. She died between the Little and Big Mountain. She was buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. She was 43 years old. She and her baby lost their lives gathering to Zion in such a late season of the year. My sister was buried at the last crossing of the Sweetwater. We arrived in Salt Lake City at 9 o'clock at night, the 11th of December, 1856. 3 out of the 4 that were living were frozen. My mother was dead in the wagon. Bishop Hardy had us taken to a home in his ward, and the brethren and the sisters brought us plenty of food. We had to be careful and not eat too much, as it might kill us. We were so hungry. Early next morning, Brother Brigham Young and a doctor came. The doctor's name was Williams. When Brother Young came in, he shook hands with all of us. When he saw our condition, our feet frozen, and our mother dead, tears rolled down his cheeks. The doctor amputated my toes using a saw and a butcher knife. Brigham Young promised me I would not have to have any more of my feet cut off. The sisters were dressing mother for the last time. Oh, how did we stand it? That afternoon, she was buried.
Thank you, Kathleen. I make her read that because I can't. But it's quite an account. My siblings and I, and our cousins as well, grew up on this story, and we felt a very close connection to our great-grandmother. While the title of great-grandmother sounds a little distant, her youngest son, Leroy, was our grandfather, and we knew him very well. We had Thanksgiving dinner at their house every year, and as a boy, I went camping with him. I'm only 1 generation away from knowing Mary Gopal-Pay personally. This story comes from a typewritten manuscript of Mary's account, reproduced on a mimeograph machine, which circulated among family members for many years. The story has since appeared in print many times. It has been retold in General Conference, in the Ensign magazine, in various church manuals, and on countless trek reenactments. But we knew there were a few inconsistencies in the story. Some of the dates and locations were suspect, mentioned by Mary, and some events were clearly out of sequence. So about 25 years ago, I decided to add a few explanatory notes, noting some of these adjustments to Mary's account in preparation for our family trip, which we took across Wyoming to retrace the journey of those 1856 companies. And then from time to time after that, over the years, as I came across new information, I added to those notes. Then several years later, my amazing sleuth of a cousin, Tricia Stoker, located Mary's original handwritten manuscript, which was in the possession, it turned out, of some second cousins. They generously allowed her to scan it and to share copies of the holograph. And there's just a scan of one of those pages. As often happens, the holograph varied from the typed and printed versions, suggesting that whoever had transcribed the original account added some additional detail and information and many other edits. In addition, as the story was told and retold at treks and at firesides, some myths and distortions began to emerge, as almost always happens in such stories. And those retellings sometimes gave a somewhat inaccurate picture of the story. I felt like it was important for family members to have an accurate, well-documented account of Mary's journey. So I began a somewhat more detailed review and analysis of Mary's handwritten account with the goal of trying to corroborate her account with other contemporary accounts from the treks, fleshing out details from other records that were available, correcting any errors that she might have made as a result of writing this nearly half a century after the events took place, and placing her story in the broader context of the 1856 emigration and rescue. I found and read the camp journal of the Hunt Company, which was the company in which her family traveled. I was able to identify, I think, all but one of the names that she mentions in her account. I read the journals or the memoirs of other people in her company. One of the interesting discoveries is that her memory was remarkably accurate 50 years after the event. She made a couple of mistakes on dates, and she combined a couple of events that were not directly connected. But for the most part, her account is stunningly accurate. That research project, which I sometimes refer to as a family history project that got a little out of hand, ended with the publication of an annotated version of Mary's memoir. That's this little book, enhanced with some longer background notes and several appendices with supplemental information, all of which was printed in this very handsome little volume that was put together by the Religious Studies Center at BYU in collaboration with Deseret Book. And I'd be happy to talk to any of you about how the publication came about. If anyone is interested, that was some great serendipity, and it made this a much, much better book than what I had originally planned to do, which was just for the family. But in the course of doing all this project, this research, I realized that I had some images and some ideas about the 1856 handcart tragedy that were probably more myth than reality. And for the next few minutes, what I want to do is share with you a few of the things that I learned from this experience about the 1856 migration. One caveat I would give there is that I realize I'm in a group of historically literate people. So you may be already aware of all these things I'm talking about, but I had known this story for years and years and was pretty well read in pioneer history, and these were kind of new ideas to me. First of all, I want to begin with a little background on the pioneer immigration in general. Somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 pioneers came to Utah over a period of 22 years, from 1847 until the arrival of the railroad in 1869. Only a very small portion of those, less than 4%, came by handcart. The first three handcart companies came in the summer of 1856. It was a very bold experiment, but it was deemed a great success with the arrival of these initial companies in the Salt Lake Valley. The fourth and fifth companies, of course, got a late start and suffered greatly. Although the use of handcarts was limited to a total of 10 companies over just 5 years, it is the image of the handcart pioneers, and particularly of the William Martin companies, that has become the most prominent pioneer image in the minds of Latter-day Saints. They left late in the season, together with the Hodges and Hunt wagon trains, and there were about 1,500 immigrant saints that were caught in the October blizzards. It is their experience that has come to symbolize the entire immigration in many ways, so much so that the very notion of a modern pioneer trek is a handcart trek. And for many of the same reasons that handcarts were first used. They're relatively simple and inexpensive. The William Martin handcart pioneers have become icons of the entire pioneer migration. Everybody recognizes the names of these companies. Very few people remember the names of the three companies that came before them that were very successful. Anybody here? This is a very literate group. Anybody know the names of the first three handcart companies? The Ellsworth Company. Yeah, and the MacArthur Company, and then the Bunker Company. In the same way that the Martin and Willie companies have become iconic, this simple narrative of Mary Goebel Pay stands out as one of the iconic accounts from those ill-fated companies of 1856. This beautiful painting, which I'm showing here by Utah artist Al Rounds, has become identified with Mary Goebel Pay and is one of the best known visual symbols of the 1856 tragedy. A young girl alone in the snow, pulling her handcart across a windswept plain. There is, however, some irony in this. And this is where some of our images begins to diverge from the reality. Mary never pulled a handcart. The handcart companies were composed of those saints who could not afford passage on the ship or the money to buy a wagon and teams when they got to Iowa City. They were funded through the Perpetual Emigrating Fund. Mary's father, on the other hand, had a produce business back in Brighton, England, and was prosperous enough to buy passage on the ship with cash. And as Kathleen mentioned earlier in her reading, purchase a wagon, team of oxen, and attend in Iowa City. They were then assigned to the Hunt Wagon Company. Nevertheless, when the blizzard struck on October 19th of 1856, the Hunt Company was traveling just behind the Martin Handcart Company and suffered along with all the handcart pioneers. Mary's father, like so many others, arrived in the valley penniless, having lost his wife and several children along the way. The painting, of course, is not meant to be historically accurate. What it does beautifully is to convey the courage of those 1856 pioneers, including young Mary Goebel Pay. One of the most tragic episodes during that emigration that winter that fall was the crossing of the North Platte River near what is now modern day Casper on October 19th. The Hunt Wagon Company, where the Goebels were, arrived at the last crossing of the Platte, which is actually the North Platte, just as the Martin Handcart Company was crossing the river and helped many of them get across. The blizzard picked up that evening and dropped 6 inches of snow overnight and continued for the next 3 days. 14 or 15 people from the Martin Company died the day after crossing the North Platte. We don't know the exact number, but we have various accounts, and they're consistent on it's either 14 or 15. There is some tragic irony here, too, that I was not aware of. Just a few miles north of where the pioneer companies crossed was a bridge across the Platte. It had been built just 4 years earlier by a Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Richards. He pronounced his name Richaz, and they called it Richaz Bridge. But it was a toll bridge, and the toll was $6 a wagon during the summer months and into the early fall. It may have been a little less than that in October, but it was still well beyond the reach of most of the immigrants, and they chose rather than to do that, to cross over the river, which had tragic results. We also tend to think of these pioneer companies as being very isolated and alone, sort of caught out in the middle of nowhere. But that's not an entirely accurate picture either. The Pioneer Trail, particularly across Nebraska, from Florence, Nebraska to the last crossing of the Platte near what is now Casper, was very heavily traveled even well into October. And the pioneer companies often met with other travelers along the road. On a single day, October the 2nd, the Hunt Company Journal notes, quote, "A company of mule teams carrying soldiers, etc., bound for Fort Laramie passed the brethren at 10 o'clock a.m. An hour later, they met a company of people with ox teams who were on their way back to the States from Utah. At noon, the brethren met a company of soldiers and mule teams from Fort Laramie," close quote, all in one day along the trail in Nebraska. Franklin D. Richards and his companions, who were returning from England on their missions, were traveling by horse carriage from Florence to Salt Lake, so they were moving faster. And they report passing not just these four principal immigrant companies, the Willie and the Martin and the Hodges and Hunt wagon trains, but the Smoot train, which was traveling just ahead of the Willie Company, Porter Rockwell, who was bringing several freight wagons out to Salt Lake, a freight wagon train delivering merchandise to the department store of Gilbert and Garrish, which has not survived to this day, and the Jacob Croft Company, which was a group of immigrating saints from Texas and Oklahoma. Parley P. Pratt and a group of missionaries were among several who were traveling east during those same months and passed by those pioneer companies out on the road. Captain William F. Reynolds of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers was traveling with Jim Bridger that October, coming out of Montana, and arrived at the last crossing of the Platte, the North Platte crossing, on October 11th, 1856, the day after the Willie Company that crossed the river there, and just 8 days before the Martin and Hunt companies arrived at the last crossing of the Platte. He compared the immigrant trail to any turnpike in the east. He reported that, quote, "We were seldom out of sight of some vehicle upon this great highway. The Platte Road is a national thoroughfare." Even further west into Wyoming, there was a lot of activity going on in October and November of 1856. There were about 1,500 pioneers in the four immigrant companies. They were accompanied by late October by members of the rescue party, several hundred members of the rescue party. They were strung out across 200 miles of high prairie in Wyoming. There were other rescue parties traveling east along the trail, bringing out additional supplies. And there were express riders going back and forth between all these groups, trying to make sure they could get help where it was needed most. In short, there was a lot of traffic out on this trail, even through October and November. Sending out resupply trains from Salt Lake City to meet the handcart companies was the standard operating procedure, which I did not realize until I started doing this work. The success, in fact, of the handcart company was dependent upon resupplying the companies with food midway through the journey between Florence and Salt Lake. About the same time that the first three companies left Florence, there were resupply wagon trains that left Salt Lake. And the two traveled towards each other, leaving at about the same time and met about halfway then between Florence and Salt Lake, about 40 days out from each destination. And that's about how much food the handcarts could carry at that point, and then they would get resupplied from the wagons and come on in. Even with this very carefully planned and carefully executed reprovision, those initial companies did report the supplies ran low and that they had to very carefully ration food along the trail. In fact, most wagon trains were also typically met by resupply wagons along the way to provide them with additional food to get into the valley. When that third handcart company arrived in Salt Lake on October 2nd, there was a sense of euphoria in the city that the handcart experiment had been successful and that the immigration season had come to a very successful conclusion that year. That was about early October to mid-October is when the last companies would typically arrive. And this was the last company that they knew of. Franklin D. Richards, who I mentioned was traveling by horse and so had passed the companies on the plains, arrived 2 days later with a report that there were 2 additional handcart companies and 2 wagon companies still out on the trail. By that time, the Hunt Company was 34 days out from Florence. And remember, the resupply was supposed to take place at 40 days out. The Martin Company was exactly 40 days out at that point. And the Willie Company was 49 days out and already perilously low on food. But because nobody in Salt Lake knew that those companies were coming, no resupply wagons had been sent out at that point. It's no wonder that Brigham Young was so animated and energetic about the need to get resupply wagons out immediately. It was clear that this would be more than a typical resupply effort. It would be a rescue mission. The first company of rescue wagons left Salt Lake on October 7th, just 3 days after Franklin D. Richards arrived with news of the remaining companies. One last thought. When we think of the Willie and Martin companies, we generally picture them in snow and freezing weather. But prior to the blizzard on October 19th, heat had been one of their greatest enemies. They recorded temperatures well over 100 degrees across Iowa and Nebraska. And that heat, combined with sandy roads, placed a great strain on both the people and their animals. When the first rescue company left Salt Lake on October 2nd, the weather in Salt Lake was balmy. No one was expecting the early winter storm that came with such suddenness and such ferocity just shortly thereafter. When the first rescue party left Salt Lake, the Hunt Company was still 12 days east of the last crossing of the Platte. They hadn't even come to the Platte River crossing at that point. And they were struggling at the time through an unusually hot autumn heat wave. The rescuers, who headed east on October 7th, had crossed the Continental Divide at South Pass and had reached the Sweetwater River when the blizzard struck on October 19th. They immediately sent out express riders going east on the trail and found the Willie Company the next day on the brink of starvation. At the other end of the trail, at that point, Mary and her family were still on the east bank of the Platte, trapped by snow and unable to cross the river. They had not crossed that night after the Martin Company. They were planning to cross the next day, and they got caught in that snow, and there was so much snow they couldn't get across the river. And they were still stuck there. And from that day on, really from October 19th, bitter cold and snow would be the constant companions of the immigrants and the rescuers alike. Well, there are a lot of other examples I could give to show how our images of pioneer history sometimes vary from reality, including some very interesting details on the role of in the rescue of the legendary Ephraim Hanks, who makes a cameo appearance in Mary's narrative. But I think this is what I've shared with you is maybe sufficient to demonstrate that our history is a lot more complex and nuanced than we sometimes realize. For me, that complexity and adds some depth, some dimension, and some detail that make my ancestors more real and more relatable and even more remarkable as I see them in their context. Still, having said that, much of the power of Mary's narrative lies in its simplicity and brevity. A father and mother with 6 young children and a 7th on the way, converts of just a few months, leave their comfortable home in England in May. In December, the father and 4 badly frozen surviving children arrive in the Salt Lake Valley with the mother's frozen body in the wagon. 3 children lie buried on the trail. Mary's narrative endures as a moving story of a young girl and her family who were willing to sacrifice everything for the gospel. The final paragraph of Mary's handwritten narrative is dated November 1909. "I have been to a reunion," she wrote. "I met Brother Langley Bailey and had a good time talking over incidents of our trip across the plains. It made me feel bad. It brought it all up again. Is it wise for our children to see what their parents passed through for the gospel? Yes, I think it is," she wrote. Mary died in 1914. Her youngest son, my grandfather, died in 1970 when I was 23 years old. My grandmother lived for another 9 years after the death of my grandfather. During her last days, my grandmother's last days, my grandfather visited her almost daily from the other side of the veil. On one such visit, he gave my grandmother this instruction: "Tell the children to be strong and keep the faith." Grandmother dutifully repeated that message to her children and to her grandchildren. And that's the message I'd like to leave with you today on behalf of my grandfather and his mother, Mary Goebel Pay. Tell the children to be strong and keep the faith. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Amen. I'd be happy to entertain questions if there's time, or you tell me if you do have some questions.
What about the auction? How did they feed the auction?
How did they feed the oxen? It was a challenge. There was not a lot of feed. There was not a lot of grass. There were a lot of buffalo along the road that would eat it up. And so that was always a challenge. A lot of them died. In fact, the Hunt Company, after they had crossed, they'd finally gotten across the last crossing of the Platte up near Casper, camped just a few miles beyond the river. And the snow was so deep they couldn't really go anywhere. And they lost several oxen. Because they just didn't have enough feed. And Captain Hunt went back to the last crossing. There was actually a military fort at the last crossing of the Platte, and there was a trading post. And he went back there to negotiate the purchase of some additional oxen because they lost some and hadn't gotten enough to eat on the trail and were starving in the snow. And so he bought some additional oxen. He was actually back there getting those oxen when the first express riders from the rescue party found the Hunt Company wagon train camped in the snow. But feeding the oxen was an issue. It was very difficult. Yes?
Under normal operation, would a rescue team or party carry supplies for just another single handcart company or multiple companies? And when they met, would they travel with them back to Salt Lake City?
Yeah, they would generally meet a specific company, and some, but not all of them, would stay with them. My grandfather's uncle, if I get this right, Arza Hinckley, actually was part of the resupply effort earlier that year. And he'd gone back and met one of those first three companies, and then had stayed with that company and came in, the 1st of October with that company. And about a week after that, or 2 weeks after that, he worked for Brigham Young at the time. Brigham Young said, I want you to take me out. I want to go meet the pioneers. And so let's get a wagon. And he drove Brigham Young out east on the trail, but they got only as far as East Canyon. Brigham Young became very ill, and Arza drove it back. And then 2 weeks later, went back out and actually links up with Ephraim Hanks, who was an old battalion chum, and kind of the rest of the Ephraim Hanks story. But Arza was with him all through all that. And he was employed by Brigham Young at the time. But yeah, they were generally assigned to meet with and then stay with a company to bring it back.
Another question.
Yeah.
What city in England did the Pays start?
Brighton. The Pays come out of Brighton.
Out of Brighton.
Mm-hmm. Southern England. And Mary mentions that they took the train. They were actually the Goebels. Her father's name was Goebel, but the Pays were also from the same area. They took the train from Brighton to London and spent the night, and then took the train from London to Liverpool, where they got on board the ship. And there was, in fact, daily train service between Brighton and London. Brighton was something of a resort town already, had daily train service, and people would come down and spend the day in Brighton, go to the beach and go home. So they took that train into London, had to change stations in London, and then take a different train up to Liverpool. And that was the common experience of a lot of those European saints.